We are going to get started with this important and hopefully pretty exciting panel, given the folks who are on it. I am Mary Beth Gassman, and I am a professor at Rutgers University. I also have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, which is the entity that is sponsoring the event today. And we are co-sponsored by the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions, which I also lead, given the topic. I do want to introduce a really important person to all of you, and that's Brandy Jones, who's on tech, and she's been sort of letting people in and will moderate the chat. So as we're going along, you can feel free to send lots of questions her way, and we'll make sure that we get the panelists to answer your questions. Our panel today is called Philanthropic Equity for Minority Serving Institutions. And as you know, MSIs, as they're called, serve a large number of low-income students and also students of color, and they're absolutely critical for our nation's success. It's nice to see that more people are noticing that as of late. You know, despite this, many of these institutions are under-resourced and experience philanthropic inequities when compared to predominantly white institutions. And so this webinar is the first one in a two-part series that we are doing to highlight MSIs and bring attention to their philanthropic challenges and, I would say, successes, and to discuss opportunities for leveraging their institutional identity, data, which is why we have researchers with us today as well, and partnerships to improve their funding opportunities. And so I am going to now introduce our panel and then my co-host for the day. And then before doing that, just want to tell you kind of how we're going to operate today. We're going to, Virgil and I will be fielding some questions to our panelists for a little while. And then we are going to open it up to all of you to get some of your questions answered. So please ask questions, because it'll make the event much more meaningful. So to introduce our panel, we have Michael Terrell, who is president of Paul Quinn College in Dallas, Texas. We have Noah Dresner, who is a professor of higher education and post-secondary education at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. We have Rowena Tomanang, who is president of San Jose City College in San Jose, California. And we have Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who is associate professor of philanthropic studies at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is at IUPUI in Indianapolis. And I am excited to introduce our co-host for today, who is Virgil Parker, who is an HBCU graduate, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about himself. I do want to say that Virgil is the person who came to the Proctor Institute, to myself and to Brandy, and it was his idea to have this panel, and I was really excited to work with him. So Virgil, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Professor Gassman, I'm very honored that you accepted my proposal to have this conversation. As a proud graduate of Howard University, I'm a lifelong member and supporter of the minority serving institutions, the community. So I'm glad we're here to have this discussion. Everyone, it's great to be with you today. To me, you know, as a student coming up through Howard University, talking about philanthropic inequalities that affect these institutions has been very important to me. Just to kind of give this a little bit more context as to why we're talking today, you know, I want to give an example of some of the inequalities that we are seeing within the higher ed community. So as some of you may know, for example, with Harvard University reported during the fiscal year 2018 a $1.42 billion advancement in philanthropy. To put that into context, Howard University, my alma mater, reported $140 million in this year alone. But that total was more than what the Howard University reported throughout the entire decade, nearly between 2010 and 2019. Now, that's important to put into perspective and to understand, because Howard is a leading HBCU and a leading minority serving institution, and its endowment nearly doubles its competitor. So if you see that large of a discrepancy between a leading minority serving institution and its other peers, just imagine how other minority serving institutions may suffer from not having the philanthropic exposure that's necessary to run its operations. Philanthropy is critical to our to institutions, and we're going to talk about that today. It can be used for facility development. It can be used for investment in research, and even supporting financial aid to students, which I have been a benefactor of from alumni who've been so willing to give through their Howard University, their HBCU. So let's get into this today and figure out how we can solve this issue around philanthropic inequality. My first question is going to go to institutional president, President Rowena. Madam President, I want to ask you, can you describe for us how philanthropy is important to your management of your institution and just operating the university, please?
Thank you so much, Virgil. And I just want to start off saying thank you to you and Mary Beth for the invitation to be on this panel and to be able to share my perspectives. And good afternoon, everyone. So as Mary Beth said earlier, I'm the president of San Jose City College, or SJCC, in San Jose in the Silicon Valley area in California. My institution is a dual designated minority serving institution. We are both Hispanic serving and also Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving. 40% of our students are Latinx, and I have 30% of our students Asian American, mostly Vietnamese, Southeast Asian. Additionally, in terms of, just so you could understand my demographics and my priorities, many of my students are first gen to college, and they are low income. In fact, I have several thousand students who come from the poorest neighborhoods in East San Jose. So the work that we do at SJCC is really about lifting our students up so that we could break that cycle of poverty that they've been in for generations. So for me, philanthropy has become a priority as a college president, as it has to some of my other colleagues in the California community college system. With the pandemic and what the pandemic has unearthed in these past, 18, 19 months or so, I've witnessed, many of my students and their family members losing employment, lack of access to technology, food insecurity, and other affordability issues. And so for me, philanthropy has really sort of been at the center of the work that I've been doing in this past year. Additionally, for our students, it is really important that we do work with philanthropic foundations and then also individual philanthropists so that we could increase the levels of investment in our institutions. For community colleges, we're about access, and we're about, educational equity and student success so that students can, meet their goals. And then as they are successful and they transfer to their institutions or they complete their career education certificates and get employment right away, that we know that that has an impact, on their families and in their communities. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, more recently, in the media, we have been getting news of these big philanthropic investments during the pandemic from industry as well as individual philanthropists. And so with this energy that's there to help our institutions, meet the goals that we have for our students and our communities, I really want to be at that table. I want to be invited, happy to be invited. I'll bring my energy and bring my team, want to introduce my students so that they can share their stories, with potential partners. So I'll go ahead and stop there and hand it over to my colleague, Michael.
Well, thank you, and I always enjoy hearing about your school. I think it's such a wonderful place, and you know, the idea of access is something that we know well at Paul Quinn College. We are one of the country's historically Black colleges. 80% of our students are Pell Grant students. We are the creators of the urban work college model, where every residential student at our school gets a job that we go out and find for them. This model has allowed us to reduce the average student debt from 40,000 to 12,000 before the pandemic, and now it looks like it's going to drop below 10,000. And when we talk about philanthropy, you know, I want to first make sure people understand that when you are at resource challenged institutions, you learn to be creative with the philanthropy you receive. We don't have the luxury, and it is a luxury, to be in a place like Harvard. And to hear those numbers is just astounding, because I wonder how many lives that we could have pulled out of poverty if we had those resources, you know, with our goal. And so what we've done is we've looked for ways to partner with philanthropic entities to build models that allow us to be less dependent on philanthropy, because we can't depend as much on philanthropy. This is a great season to be a minority serving institution, but we don't know how long this season lasts. And, you know, to put it into context, when Virgil talked about $150 million added was it added this year to the endowment?
To Howard University, that's what they raised, 140 million, yes, sir.
Yeah, so we've never had that kind of money at Paul Quinn College. And so we have had to be creative. And this year we've had more resources than we have had perhaps ever. And just to give you a sense of what we've been able to accomplish, having more resources, we built the first new buildings in 50 years on our campus. We created partnerships with the Dallas Independent School District and KIP network, charter network, to add a Dallas Independent School K through 12, 6 through 12 International Baccalaureate Academy, and a KIP K through 12 institution on the campuses. We added 3 different majors in our first graduate program. We redid all the roads. We managed to redo all the buildings on campus. And so when you have access to resources, you can level the playing field in a way that is necessary in this environment. It's amazing to me now to live. One of the reasons, what I was doing before I came into our chat, was we unveiled our brand new basketball court. And to listen to people marvel at what they see going on the campus is heartwarming, but it also just reminds me of, well, this is what happens when you have some resources. And to encourage philanthropy to bet more broadly, right? I think it's wonderful that we invest in well-worn places that are doing good things. I just wish that we would see investment from a broader lens and understand what could be done if, you know, the same people didn't give the same money to the same institutions. Just food for thought. You give Harvard a certain amount of money and they say, thank you. You give us the same amount of money, we might name the college after you, right? It's just the way it works.
No, I thank you for that perspective, President Terrell and President Rowena, both of you talking about the importance of philanthropy and basically how your institutions play an important role in our community. Professor Dresner, I want to transition to you, specifically talking about the perspective on philanthropic racial equity, as President Swell just alluded to a few moments ago. Can you just tell us generally, how has your research informed you about the importance of racial giving when it comes to philanthropy?
Thank you so much, and I'm just a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you and Mary Beth for inviting me to join the panel, and just to, it's hard to go after 2 inspiring presidents to talk about research when it's the on-the-hands work that actually helps most of minority serving institutions. So I want to thank them for all the work that they've been doing for their students and the larger field. I would say that my research has informed my perspective in two general ways. And I'll start off by couching that to say that, it now goes back over 20 years ago, but I started off my career as a fundraiser. I was a development officer and advancement officer at a private research institution in the Northeast. And part of my reason for leaving and going into graduate school and eventually then deciding to devote my career to researching philanthropy in higher education is because of my experience fundraising and realizing racial inequities. And at first, noticing that I was not being successful with my alumni of color and trying to understand why that was. And I experienced a supervisor who, quite honestly, racist, said it's because they're not generous. And that was the day that I said, okay, I need to leave here. And I started figuring out what I was doing next. And that's how I ended up with the privilege of working with Mary Beth as my professor towards my doctoral work. And I really have used my research to prove that person wrong, right? Because I knew in my heart that it wasn't wrong, but I also wanted to have the empirical research to show that it was wrong, right? And I would say that there's two things that informs. One is that when you actually look at a lot of my research and others, we actually see that alumni of color and people of color are more generous to higher education and philanthropic causes more generally than the white population. However, when you look at absolute dollars and you think about where wealth is, the headlines go to the white individuals and the white population when you're thinking about that. So part of it is rethinking how we think about who is generous, who is giving, and not focusing only on absolute dollars, right? So that's one perspective. The other perspective that I think is important about racial equity is that when I've done my research in different communities, including majority communities, asking why people give, social justice often is a motivating factor. And I think that that is extremely important. There's plenty of critique of philanthropy in the academic scholarship for good reason about what its motivation is, what's behind it, some of the foundation giving in terms of controlling policy and things like that. And I don't want to cut those conversations off, but I also want us to focus on the good aspects and trying to think about how can we bring forward these stories of social justice philanthropy, highlight that, motivate others to engage in it, and also think about how can we, knowing that alumni and people of color are more generous than the white population, how can we teach institutions, both minority serving institutions and predominantly white institutions, to better activate that giving as well, and thinking about changing our practice away from focusing on what motivates, quite honestly, white, wealthy, heterosexual men to give, to thinking about how can we change the culture of our fundraising practice to engage others to give, because they're just as generous, if not more. So that's really what I've been learning from my research around racial equity within philanthropy.
Thank you. Professor Freeman, I'm going to ask you the same question, but Professor Dresner, I just want to say, thank you for using your research to debunk that myth that your supervisor provided about people of color in philanthropy. That's important that you did that work. Professor Freeman, same question to you. What has your research taught you about the importance of philanthropic giving, particularly from a racial equity lens, please?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Virgil. And thanks for conceptualizing this and the invitation. I'm also an HBCU grad with the Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, so appreciate you and the perspective you're bringing. Similarly, my research on philanthropy and communities of color also comes from my lived experiences of being born into and raised in a generous philanthropic community of color. I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of Black Baptist preachers and first ladies, and so I grew up in a very generous church community where everybody was constantly giving, constantly engaging, constantly caring and sharing. I remember very fondly the old folks swaying back and forth and singing songs like "You Can't Beat God Giving, no matter how you try," right? And just knowing that it's the generosity of God, the generosity of community that got them through. And yet not once using that word philanthropy. They didn't think, that's not how they thought of themselves. That's not how they related to each other. They were just doing and expressing who they were and who they aspired to be. So they didn't feel a need to give it this other kind of name. And yet when I too entered fundraising like Noah, where I regularly found myself the only African-American in the room, I found myself in a field and in organizations that were disconnected, didn't know about these traditions, didn't have a value for them. And it was confusing to me because that's what produced me. And yet it's not evident in this very field that's dedicated to it. And then later going into the academy, working on my PhD in philanthropy, the same thing, reading the great theorists, the literature, and not seeing communities of color taking seriously in that. This idea, as Noah said, they are recipients, they're not agents, they're not on the front edge of giving themselves. And so really what I wanted to do was try to address that. And I came along at a time where Mary Beth was beginning to do her thing. So I had the benefit of pulling some of her early articles and some of the folks before her, but folks weren't paying attention to this. And so it's very important to for me to engage that. And so that's why I do the history of philanthropy in communities of color, history of African-American philanthropy, looking at higher education as well, philanthropy and fundraising. And I found that it's that same inequitable attention that's paid to philanthropy in communities of color in the literature, in the professional fields. Well, that's the same inequity in grant making, right? That has those dollars not going to Black-led, Indigenous-led, Asian-led organizations, right? And it's the same. I'm grateful to Dr. Jackie Copeland, from the Black Philanthropy Month movement. She's pointing out these inequities in the social impact capital markets, right? Black-led organizations are not getting access to that either. And that's a multi-billion-dollar market too. So I aspire for my research to change these narratives, looking at, again, people of color as givers, as donors, maybe not using the word, but engaging it in different ways through all of their institutions, churches, clubs, literary societies, schools, just looking after people informally in the neighborhood. It's everywhere. And so bringing that recognition into the conversation, into the research, into practice. So hopefully we can, help to address those and change what we're seeing in these grant making dynamics and these other funded dynamics.
Thank you, Professor Freeman. That was a lot of context there. Appreciate it. Professor Gasman, you want to ask the next question?
Sure. So I'm going to stay with Tyrone and Noah for a minute before we move back to our presidents. And Tyrone, you sort of alluded to this, but I'd like you to go a little further for people listening, because I think it really is important. So I'm just gonna give a little background on something. So I finished my PhD in 2000. And I wrote my dissertation related to philanthropy, white philanthropy in African-American communities, and I, especially in the support of Black colleges. And one of the things that I noticed at that time is that there weren't a lot of people writing about philanthropy. And whenever I would submit things to conferences, I would get a little note back that said, "We're so sorry, we can't take this because philanthropy is not central to the study of higher education." I just want you to remember that. And I know that some of my students also over the years received that same message, which is so interesting given the huge outsized role that philanthropy plays in higher education. And so I guess what I'd love for both of you to answer, starting with Tyrone, is so do you think that research, and this could be historical research, quantitative research, qualitative research, is being taken seriously on philanthropy, because it is so important that we understand all of these major gifts going to minority serving institutions right now, right? And how's that changing? Here's another question to add to that. So there might be folks on here who are interested in studying philanthropy related to HBCUs or Hispanic serving institutions or other types of MSIs. How do they get involved in that? And why is that important for philanthropy at MSIs? Why is it important that we know things about giving?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Well, first, I mean, what you're doing at Proctor, Noah's contributed to this through the journal, Philanthropy and Education, right? It is being taken more seriously. It's still a challenge. There's still peers in higher ed who are not quite sure what we're doing or why we're doing it, but the impact is undeniable, and you see it every day in the various headlines. So it is important to remember that. I think too, it's important to remember too that, you know, Seton Hall has a database of philanthropy and nonprofit management programs, and they document about 300 colleges and universities that have everything from a single course to full-fledged degree programs in philanthropy or nonprofit management. And so that speaks to the space in the higher education landscape for it. But it's interesting to note that that number's been kind of flat, because some programs have kind of fallen aside while others come on. So there hasn't really been a net gain. They're updating it now, the survey now, so we'll see if we end up with more. But it speaks to this space that people are looking for education. There are many different programs out there. And then also, you know, we're a school of philanthropy. Most of the programs are in schools of business, schools of public policy or public administration, growing in schools of education. And so one of the reasons why we created a school of philanthropy is we wanted to mark out a space in the higher education landscape and say, hey, this is just as important as the school of business, as the school of government and policy, because the nonprofit sector and philanthropy is very consequential. And you can argue that sector existed before the other two, right? Because it was that, you know, the early colonial experience where there were, you know, governments were just getting established, where people were already kind of looking after each other in different ways. And so that's something to remember, that those programs are growing. You can get a bachelor's, master's, or PhD now in it. We're starting a new professional doctorate in philanthropic leadership that came directly from the field. Practitioners were saying, hey, I don't want to become a professor. I want to stay in my development role or my presidential role, or I want to rise to that next one, but I want a terminal degree. I want to learn some research skills. I want to bring data into my leadership. Can you help us? So I think those things are important. And then when you look at, you know, President Sorrell's bachelor's degree in fundraising, the Valdry Center at Southern, you know, HBCUs, right, are marking their territory here, and it's very important. Delaware State's been doing a symposium for 10 years on HBCU philanthropy, has been a part of that. And another development for the audience, you know, the African American Development Officers Network will be 25 next year. You know, I mentioned I was regularly the only African American in the room in fundraising. Well, this is an organization, you can go to their conference and there'll be 400 Black and Brown fundraisers in that conference with you. And it's an incredible experience. And new groups like Woke, Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy, F3, the fabulous female fundraisers out of Atlanta, Men of Color in Development just started a few months ago. So there are a lot of people of color in the field. And so it speaks to this growing importance. Many of them are at MSIs. And so it's important to recognize the critical nature of this field, why we need more research, we need more programs, and there are lots of dedicated pathways now to enter into the field.
Thank you. Noah?
Just to add on to the fabulous answer that we just heard from Tyrone, I'm really excited by the amount of places where you can study philanthropy now, which is new in the past couple of decades, but getting people to do the research and to publish the research is almost still a struggle in many ways, especially in the higher ed space. I remember just a couple years ago, the Journal of Higher Education, which is one of the top journals in our field, published a piece, and it was the first time in something like over 20 years that they devoted pages that specifically to research on philanthropic giving. That's just horrible, right? And oftentimes it wasn't that there wasn't strong research, it was that editors and reviewers were sending out messages like Mary Beth received and that I received saying, this is strong work. I remember getting one of those and then going into Mary Beth's office, you know, really frustrated. This is really strong work. Here's a couple small things to tweak, but we're still denying it, because we're not sure it fits our readership, right? That's still problematic. That I think is still happening to some extent. We're starting to see more work. The other aspect that I think is interesting about the field, although it's showing that there's increasing interest, is that we have so many wonderful scholar practitioners who are doing professional degrees, professional EDDs, hopefully coming out and joining the Lilly Family School's professional doctorate in philanthropic studies and writing dissertations, but then they go into back into their life of practice after graduating without sharing the wonderful work that they've done and getting it out there. So some of the work that I've been trying to do is trying to figure out how, even if I can't encourage, as Tyrone mentioned, I edit a journal called Philanthropy and Education. Oftentimes I'm reaching out to recent graduates and saying, hey, will you convert your dissertation into an article for me? I can help you with some mentoring process on that. But I also understand that they have a different job, right? But so how can we get that information out? How can we be trying to share those dissertations and that work out with others? The other part of the question was minority serving institutions and HBCUs. We're seeing much more of this research, but not enough. There's so many questions that could still be asked and answered. So Mary Beth asked, you know, if there are some people who are on the Zoom today wondering about, can they do this work? Yes, please reach out to me, reach out to Tyrone, reach out to Mary Beth, reach out to anyone who's willing to. I just volunteered, the three of us. We will help you figure out where to do your doctorate with us. We will support you. We will figure out how to make it a reality, and we will thank you for it. So yes, yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Virgil.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just want to say briefly, you know, what I'm hearing from input from our panelists today is the reason why I wanted to have this dialogue. I thank you all so much just to talking about the importance of the space and, you know, how people can even get involved. President Sarah, I'm going to direct the next question back to you. You know, a few minutes ago, you did speak about putting context into wealth and wealth going to certain institutions and the power of wealth specifically, and even how, you know, certain donors can approach certain minority serving institutions and what that impact would be like. Can you expand on that? Can you talk to us about how you'd recommend philanthropists to approach minority serving institutions, specifically alumni who have a high concentration of wealth, but are not an alumni of minority serving institutions? Why should they be inspired to give back similar to the Mackenzie Scotts? Please, President.
Well, let me say this. I think that we have to first analyze why there is this disparity. And the disparity exists because the historically Black colleges were founded to educate freed slaves and their progeny. There were 4 million enslaved people at the time that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. And so when the enslaved people became free, you were effectively giving freedom to people who, for the entirety of their American experience, had been forbidden by law from, forget about amassing wealth and property, they weren't even allowed to read and write. And so the institutions were started for people who couldn't pay to go to school because they had no resources, because they weren't allowed to have resources. An entire southern part of this nation was made wealthy through the slave trade. And entire cities are still wealthy on the backs of the slave trade. And so when you look at the alums of these other institutions, they started with more resources. So they, you know, you call up a school and their folks had the ability to pay for a student to go to school. They all graduated because, you know, what people fail to realize is the greatest predictor of graduation and completion is your family income level. Not your intellectual ability, not your test scores, it's your family income level. And so for us, we have to find people who would be, first of all, amenable to our stories and amenable to our histories, and not feel embarrassed or ashamed. Because look, in Texas, we're dealing with people who are trying to erase the entire history of slavery and of Jim Crow and of all that. So it's really sort of hard to engage those people in conversations of philanthropy when they don't even want to acknowledge the reasons for your institution's existing. So you wipe out an entire segment of individuals as prospective donors because they're not going to align with your institution's mission, your institution's history. Now you can approach them, but it's a really, really hard sell. Your alums didn't start with the same amount of disposable income. So chances are, because 60–70% of historically Black college students are Pell Grant students. So chances are they're going to have student loans. They're going to have Parent Plus loans. So they're going to view the relationship with giving through the prism of debt that they incurred to enroll in your school. So now you've got a much more difficult road to travel there. So we now have to find people who will be amenable to our missions, to our narrative, to the possibilities of what we're going to do. And if you are reducing the field of play, in a way of saying it, then you're also reducing the amount of money you probably can raise. And we look at all of this, and we sometimes act as if we're surprised that our minority serving institutions are behind. Well, we're behind because it was a really long road to travel to even get to the point where we're behind. And it's interesting, when we talk about philanthropic careers, our Center for Fundraising and Philanthropy, like that major, has been successful in a way that we hadn't planned, and not as successful in a way that maybe we had planned, in which I want to be clear, it's going to be amazingly successful, but we had to sort of figure out what our thing was. So that major tends to attract now our best and brightest students. And they don't come in thinking that they want to major in fundraising and philanthropy, but when they're exposed to the opportunity and they're exposed to corporate philanthropy, right? The ability to be in charge of money, the direction of money, and giving it to their causes and the communities that they serve, they love that. Like, that's an amazing career path. I wish I could tell you that we thought it would have that result. We hoped it would have that result, but it is extraordinary what that means. So to wrap it all up, and what I was really trying to say is this. It takes us longer to amass the wealth because we were never intended to have the wealth. Because the system of wealth that others are using was built upon our Black and brown backs. And so our institutions, which were designed to help us become full-fledged Americans, were never fully designed to level the economic playing field. So the system is functioning the way, in many ways, in which it was designed to function. And our institutions won't catch up until we really say intentionally and almost to the exclusion of other things that this is what we're going to do. And I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for that. I am saying that without a certain level of intentionality, it will be extraordinarily difficult to make up for lost ground.
Thank you, President Sorrell. I really appreciate those comments. And I really appreciate how you were able to bring in the context of a cultural connection, you know, to have one or to not to have one, how that can inspire philanthropic giving. President Rowena, I'm going to ask the same question to you, but also include that angle of a cultural connection. How would you encourage philanthropists to approach Hispanic serving institutions and other minority serving institutions who are and who are not alumni of those types of institutions, and why should they be inspired to give there? Please let us know.
Great. I have to say that I love following Dr. Sorrell because he just is able to unearth all of these really great salient points for me to pick up on. So again, I think the context, as you said, Michael, is so critical in terms of the work and the efforts that we do at our institution. So for me, SJCC coming, being from the community college world, so we know that community colleges were created to provide more access to higher education for under-resourced communities, and with our MSI status, that becomes, even more important in terms of increasing college resources to enhance our student success efforts. Now, also for community colleges, we're always battling this stigma that's attached to us, that our students are the workers of the future, right? They're the workers here in Silicon Valley. They are not the leaders in Silicon Valley. So I feel like we always have to make the case, within philanthropy, that our students are just as leaders, their leadership qualities and their leadership potential is just the same as the students at Stanford, 20 miles away, or Santa Clara University or our UCs. So I think that's what we always battle against. And I've been observing some of the patterns in terms of giving even and partnering even with our industry partners. And there is a tendency, for giving to happen, I think, at least speaking for the Valley, in the K-12, and then community colleges get bypassed. And then a lot of giving is happening at the four-year universities, nearby to us. So I think that, is an important context for, me and my efforts at trying to reach out to philanthropists, because it isn't as if they are knocking at my door, very actively, in terms of the work that I do. So some recommendations that I'd like to make, I think, is, we just got done talking a little bit about the research and how there is more need for research, in philanthropy. And so, I recommend that, philanthropists, if they are invested in educational equity, racial equity in education for our students, that they also engage in the research. They should also do research on our institutions and be very open, to learning more about us and be proactive about it. And another thing that they can do, which is a partnership example that I can provide, is if they don't know where to start, they can look for organizations that have been intentionally designed to play that mediator role, between our institutions and philanthropists. So fortunately for me and our other colleges here in Silicon Valley area, we have a Silicon Valley Leadership Group organization, and that group has a community college strand. So they deliberately and intentionally connect industry partners to the local community colleges to develop partnership projects, for student equity, our student equity goals and our student success goals. Likewise, we have a Silicon Valley Foundation that is sort of overarching. They work with four-year universities and also K-12 and community colleges. And so those two groups often annually do convenings where they bring all of the educational partners together, in these meet and greets, so that we have access to philanthropic partners. So those are just a few of my recommendations. And I know that I've benefited as a college president by being invited to these events, and additionally, some of our partners, such as, our Center for Minority Serving Institutions, also play that role where they bring, institutional leaders and college presidents, into the room, into an event, with philanthropic foundations who care about education, such as Lumina, Kresge, James Irvine Foundation, and here in California, our Foundation for Community Colleges.
Thank you, President Rowena. That was all excellent context. A little later, we may get to a question from the audience that actually addressed the university advancement professionals. So hopefully we can talk about that and give more explanation to what you just described. Thank you. Professor Gasman?
Sure. Okay, so Tyrone and Noah, I'm going to kind of move back over to you for a minute. And I'm excited that there's a nice balance of questions for the whole panel that are coming in. So thank you. So I'm curious, you kind of heard a little bit from Marina and from Michael about, kind of how they might want to be approached and some of the long-term systemic issues that just play a part in who's even willing to approach MSIs, right? To provide philanthropic support. So I'm curious about your thoughts based on your research and your read of philanthropic research. What do you think are some best practices for philanthropists in terms of reaching out to MSIs? How do you do that in a caring way, an ethical way, an equity-oriented way, and maybe even why do you think they should be reaching out to MSIs? And whoever would like to go first, it's fine.
I could try. We just released a study on high net worth giving, and 1 in 5 affluent households in the U.S. supported racial justice or social justice last year. And 11% said that now social justice is one of their top 3 priorities. Now, these are improvements over the last time we did these studies, but still low. We got more work to do. But I think it's important because there's another 20% who said they'd like to know more about social justice and racial justice. So that presents an opportunity. We also saw in this particular study that for many of these affluent households, it's the commitment to the organization that drives the giving. Well, in this study, they said the commitment to the issue is now at least on par with the commitment to the organization. And for some, the commitment to the issue is above the organization. So if that commitment is now perhaps superseding the organizations, that presents an opportunity for MSIs. As you tell your story, Dr. Sorrell is a master at telling, the Quinite story, right? Letting people know that you're out there and that you're an option. It's important to do that. I also think that there's some lessons for history. That's the kind of work that I do. In my work, Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, I tell the history of Black philanthropy, but I also shine the light on her philanthropic relationships with HBCUs. She's the Black entrepreneur from the early 20th century, very generous. She was giving to many of the same places that Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller were, many times rivaling gifts from the Slater Fund and other places, Tuskegee, Mary McLeod Bethune's, Daytona Norman, which is now Bethune-Cookman. But her relationship was very different. They didn't have to do the same political dance with her that they had to do with Carnegie and Rockefeller. She, Mary McLeod Bethune was a master at telling those industrial philanthropists, we're doing the industrial curriculum, but then she would go back and she'd go do the broader things that she wanted to do, right? There was no dance like that. Madam Walker related to them differently. She valued them. She was connected. She had that lived experience. And so I think there's lessons for philanthropists new to racial equity, new to social justice here in that kind of story. And this idea of trusting these organizations, right? This is why the trust-based philanthropy movement is so important. That's emerging over the past few years. I think these donors should plug into that conversation and see why it's important to give and to trust and to be there as a source of support. I think it's important also for them to use their voice and advocacy to support this, because at the end of the day, philanthropy is not enough. philanthropy, charitable dollars is only 12, 13% of all the revenue to the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits get more money from government and fees for service than they do from philanthropy. And we also know that public policy is deeply implicated in this. And so Madam Walker knew this. She was an advocate for anti-lynching, which was the Black Lives Matter movement of that time. She spoke out about the treatment of Black soldiers in World War I and the hypocrisy of them having to fight overseas for rights not guaranteed at home. And so I think these donors should think about how they put their mouth where their money is too, right? How they will raise up and use their political influence, because if we're going to really advance racial equity, we've got to deal with state legislatures. We've got to deal with police unions. We've got to deal with teachers unions. All of these things, right, respond and require this type of advocacy. And the other thing that comes from this is to give for the long view. Give over the long term. It's not a one and done. One of the things, I challenge particularly racial equity donors is to say, don't be like disaster donors. Disaster donors are a very generous lot. When the media, they learn about a tragedy, whether it's a flood, a hurricane, an earthquake, terrorism, they swoop in and they respond to the hilt. They give oftentimes more money, more clothing, more food than can be used. But there's a problem, because after the media goes away, they move on. And the research shows they are less likely to renew, even for the same incident. They move on to something else. And racial equity is such that we can't afford to move on. Right, we need those gifts made, we need those pledges made, we need people to stay focused and to stay engaged, right? If George Floyd and Breonna Taylor brought you into giving to racial equity, we need you now because Ahmaud Arbery's trial is about to begin. It's not over, it's not a one and done. So I definitely say, take a long view, give this year, renew next year, renew the year after, set up estate plans, endow funds to support these MSIs on this call and the broader landscape, because they're going to need that. As Dr. Sorrell said, there's a long history to make up for all the lost money, interest, the lost time, because these institutions have intentionally been denied access to resources.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all that enthusiasm too, Tyrone.
Get me going.
Yeah, no, it's good. Noah, your thought.
Yes to everything that Tyrone said. And also I would say, don't be a white savior philanthropist either. Don't give as if it's charitable giving to people who don't have and don't know how to spend it and put too many strings attached to it. Give your philanthropy as a partnership. Give your monies to the institutions and say, I understand that you know how to best use this to do the good work that you're doing. That doesn't mean that it needs to go fully to unrestricted giving. I know it's very difficult to raise unrestricted dollars. So I'm not trying to be pie in the sky and say that there's not going to be restrictions. But really enter into the conversation, as I'm speaking to the white philanthropists, from a opportunity to go in partnership and allow the institutions, the Hbcus, the MSIs, all different types of MSIs, to lead in that partnership. They're going to know where the dollars are needed best, how to use that money strategically, in ways that you're not going to understand. And I think that just like disaster philanthropists, many of our philanthropists, when we have more data and more time to look back at racial equity philanthropy that is currently going on, we might see that there is a white savior complex philanthropy going on there as well. And we need to crack that egg.
Can you crack that egg? Right? I mean, just in all candor, can you crack that egg?
So Michael, here's something of interest, and that is that I noticed that with these Mackenzie Scott donations, she specifically stated everywhere that she did not want the media to write about her. She did not want these donations to be about her. If you read her Medium post, she says, please don't call me. She's not doing interviews, right? But still, people have been trying to put the focus on her rather than the institutions. And she specifically says in the Medium post, please look at the work that these institutions are doing. I'm trying to get you to focus on them and not focus on me as this incredible person, but please focus on this incredible work that they're doing. So I think perhaps our system does, the way that we do things doesn't even allow us to, it allows us, but we're so inclined to spotlight the philanthropist that even when the philanthropist doesn't want to be spotlighted, we're going to try to do it anyway. And Noah, I'm sorry that I responded to that. It wasn't.
So the question that I would ask about that is, and let me just be transparent. We weren't a recipient of the Mackenzie Scott Award, right? And that's fine. We're not begrudging anyone who was. In fact, I'm thrilled for those who were. But what's interesting is we had a gift from someone that asked us to remain anonymous. It was a significant gift. If we had disclosed who the gift was from, it would have become a thing. That donor was very, very clear that they wanted the work to be the thing. And, and look, if we had been able to use their name, maybe we could have leveraged it into some other resources, but we respected that, never thought twice about anything other than honoring the donor's wishes. But it's interesting. Like I applaud Mackenzie Scott. I think that what her gift is doing for institutions is pretty remarkable. But I think we have to recognize the system will always want to tell a savior story, right? Always want to tell the savior story, which undermines the institution's ability to tell their own stories. And so that's why I asked, are these things even possible?
I think it's a lot of hard work, but I think that we need to start calling it out. And I know that some people have called it out before, but there's not enough people calling it out. And that's why I wanted to say it directly, right? Because if we start calling it out, then the donors might be thinking about it, and then they might choose to give in a different way, right? The story of your anonymous gift also was happening, it was around 2010 where these institutions around the country started getting 7-figure gifts anonymously. And the only thing that linked all of the institutions was there was a female president at the time. We still have no idea where the money came from, but it spotlighted female leadership in higher education, right? So you're absolutely right. We could be thinking about how do we give? And if this is racial equity giving, and this is about the institutions that it's going to, perhaps anonymous giving is one of the ways that we could do this, but are there other ways that we could be thinking about as donors, focusing on the institution and highlighting and thinking about that? That's really difficult, right? Because it's not only the institution wanting to tell the story, but we don't have control over the media narratives either. So I get that it's difficult, but I think collectively we need to talk about it, expose it, think about it, and get others talking about it. And then maybe we can start whittling a little bit away at it.
Thank you, Noah. We are gonna do one more of our questions to the panel. Virgil is gonna ask it, and then we are gonna open up to questions, which we have tons of them that have come in. So we have lots and lots of great questions that have come in. Virgil, you wanna ask the last official question?
Sure. I want to ask, first of all, I loved how we went on just a slight tangent. That was great. Thank you all again. But I want to ask a question about culture, philanthropy culture. And I'm going to direct this question to President Rowena. How are you creating a culture of philanthropy on your campuses, amongst students, teaching and infusing into students' minds that philanthropic racial equity is essential to the success of higher ed and the general industry? How are you infusing that into their thoughts so that this can be a cultural norm in the next few years? President Rowena, can you start us off on that question?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So for me, I've only been at my current institution just a little bit under 2 years. I was president of Berkeley City College for 4 years prior. And so I think for me, the work that I wanted to start doing right away was sort of an extension of the work that I was doing in Berkeley. And it was around trying to develop, an alumni culture, because that is something very difficult for community colleges. I think earlier somebody mentioned, the advancement offices, advancement work. And the majority of community colleges do not have resources to set up an advancement office. Typically, when we have foundations that are available to us, like I have a district foundation, and it's very limited staffing. And that has been my experience in the past 26 years working in community colleges. So we do have to be more intentional, and find resources to develop that work. And that includes, setting up opportunities for alumni engagement, setting up alumni database, is really important. So fortunately for me, I came to this new institution and was told that in 2021, this year, I would be celebrating my centennial, my 100th year anniversary of the institution. And it would be a way for our institution to tell our story of how we've impacted the Valley, from the Valley of Heart's Delight, an agricultural community, to our students impacting the development of the tech industry and other industries. So I've been leveraging my centennial. So even with the pandemic, I've been able to hold different kinds of alumni engagement events, which are also partnership events, with community and civic partners and industry partners who, have worked with the college and the district, for many, many decades. So I invested, I invested in Graduate to help me begin to develop, this alumni network with potential mentoring opportunities in the future, because we know that we need to keep our alumni engaged. It's not just come to an event, a fundraising event annually once a year. Also, in terms of highlighting and making visible all of the work that our programs are doing, we've been outreaching to alumni. So I have an Umoja program, which is an African-American Black student success program. So I started the first annual during Black History Month, Umoja fundraising event, for scholarships, for emergency grants. And we've engaged our African-American community and other partners and alumni, to get closer to us and attend that event annually. Likewise, I started a first annual event for our undocumented students, our ALMAS program, and engaged the Latinx community and alumni, to participate in activities, offer themselves up as mentors, for current students and future students. And then the last thing that we've been doing very well is our history. We have a legendary athletics track and field program. And so we have a number of Olympic athletes, gold medalists, silver medalists, African-American, Latinx, as part of our legacy. So we are bringing alumni back, with our athletics to celebrate our history, of scholar athletes. And somebody earlier also talked about I think Dr. Sorrell Michael talked about, for giving, we can name a building after you, right? And so I have a gym renaming, opportunity, and we're renaming our new basketball gym after one of our historic legendary coaches, who is the most winningest, community college basketball coaches, African-American, Coach Percy Carr. We're doing that during Black History Month, and we're bringing back more of our athletic alumni. So those are just a couple of, activities that I've been really hyper engaged in, in the midst of addressing this pandemic, that we've all been in with the institution. So, but it's exciting work too, because there's a lot of opportunities with this big celebration of 100 years.
Thank you, and congratulations for that. I think that's incredible. President Sorrell, I'm going to direct the question to you now, but I also want to include more context to the question. President Rowena also talked about how she's working with her alumni. So I'm going to add that to the layer of the question. How are you working, and how can other presidents and minority serving institutions work to shift the mindset of cultural thinking around philanthropy so that more philanthropic racial giving becomes a norm amongst students and the alumni of minority serving institutions? How is that possible? President Sorrell, please.
No, great question. So we do it in several ways. First of all, we change the culture and the value system of the institution. So we tell our students, we subscribe to the institutional ethos of we over me. The needs of a community supersede the wants of an individual. And we encompass their experience, or we enclose their experience in this idea that you don't get to be selfish, that you stand on the shoulders of people who made extraordinary sacrifices for you to enjoy the moment that you are enjoying, right? No matter how bad your life is, you're not picking cotton, all right? So foundationally, we have an obligation to give back. And then we are very intentional in improving the campus in ways that makes it clear what your money allows us to do. We have renovated every single thing on this campus. We renovated the chapel. We renovated all throughout the administration classroom building. The student union, the cafeteria has been renovated multiple times. The student fitness center has been renovated multiple times. Student support services have been renovated. The Grand Lounge has been renovated. The library is currently serving as a 6 through 12 school, which allowed the people who leased it to invest $3 million in renovating it, that when it comes back to us, that will have been renovated. The roads have been redone. Everything has been redone so that you can say to people, this is what your resources allow to happen. And then when we renovate things, we don't just do the bare minimum. We create experiences for people to come back and be generally awed by. And then we said, look, our institutional goal is the eradication of intergenerational poverty. So the only way we do that is through a collection of resources. And your success, your ability to do well, because the other thing we tell our students is, listen, one of the things we've learned, I'll say this, one of the things we've learned about students from under-resourced communities, they tend to have this incredibly giving and servant-oriented heart. And in doing so, though, they tend to aspire for the things that they've seen. And in under-resourced communities, the people that folks tend to admire are nonprofit leaders, right? Community organization leaders. So the students all aspire to start nonprofits and to be community leaders. And so my question to them is always, who's going to fund your nonprofit? And they say, well, we'll go out and raise money. I say, okay, that's cool. I was like, I do that for a living, right? I was like, you know what another word for raising money is? It's begging, right? I was like, so where are you going to get the money to fund your idea? And it creates this awkward moment for us. I said, well, let me ask you this question. What if you went out and made the money to fund your own interests, right? What if we got rid of a nonprofit mindset temporarily and created a for-profit mindset that then allowed you to fund your own dreams, because the people who fund your dreams own your dreams, right? You don't have the dream that you have the dream that the donor allows you to have. Now, in the best case scenario, you all are aligned and it works out beautifully, but you are still beginning this relationship in one of a subservient manner. And so what we tell our students is, it is an us thing. We have an obligation to do more for all of us, but you have an obligation to go out and create wealth for yourself and your family and fund your own interests. And if you look at our model, we are beginning to see alums do things that heretofore you just haven't seen. We have alums in venture capital. We have alums who are doing extraordinary things in entrepreneurship, but it's starting to become a critical mass. Before we would have, you see success stories, but they weren't always consistent. Now you're starting to see a bundling of those success stories. The joke we have on campus is, I will be the favorite Paul Quinn president of whoever is president 25 years from now, right? 25, 30 years from now, because they will wind up with the maturing of the alums that will graduate now and start careers that will allow them to accumulate vast amounts of capital. So we just tell them it's part of your narrative, the narrative of this institution, of yourself, and this is the expectation that we have for you.
Thank you, President Terrell. Thank you for talking about your legacy. I hope it does prove to be very impactful. Professor Gasman, you want to ask the next question?
Sure. All right. So this is a question from the audience, and I'd be really curious to hear a research perspective and maybe a president perspective if you have any insights on this. So I think this is a really important question, especially given what Michael just said. And that is, what does the research say, and maybe we can talk about practice too, about communities of color and estate planning? So there's philanthropic giving, and then there's estate planning, right? And and that could be anything from leaving your life insurance policy to institutions to setting up, if I can go all the way back to my PhD program when I took all these philanthropic studies courses, charitable remainder trusts and all kinds of things like that. I'm curious, especially from Noah and Tyrone, what are we learning about communities of color acquiring wealth, and I understand the discrepancies, but using their assets to give back, and maybe to minority serving institutions?
I can jump in first. So we know that when comparing to the white population, communities of color are engaging in planning of wills and planning of philanthropic giving at a much lower rate than the majority. So I do think that there is not only, there's an opportunity here, but there's an opportunity for thinking about educating about the importance of estate planning generally, and also the importance of what you can do with your wealth afterwards in terms of philanthropic giving. I think that there's oftentimes we also see, and I think Tyrone talked about way at the beginning of the conversation, all the different ways that communities of color are philanthropic that might not fit the white definition of philanthropy. And we also see that in terms of the way that communities of color even engage in reporting of their philanthropic giving with the IRS as well, which is much reduced rate of doing itemized deductions and things like that, even with the changes that we had a couple of years ago with taxes. But this is all to say that I think that there's an opportunity here, and not just approaching it in terms of now that you have wealth, because if people don't feel that they are wealthy, they're not going to hear that message. But I think much of what you were talking about in terms of thinking about life insurance, thinking about what can I do with my retirement plan, all of those things that when you go to HR, even as a recent graduate from college and fill out all that paperwork, there's beneficiaries that need to be written down. This is an opportunity to even be talking about how you can give back to your alma mater or to other minority serving institutions in that way. And we just don't have those conversations yet. So I worry about only talking about it in the context of wealth, because we might lose people in that conversation. But what are the other ways that we can be thinking about traditional estate planning outside of the box, and also making sure in general that communities of color are having these conversations to engage in this work when they have the ability to, rather than when it's too late.
Tyrone, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I would add, first, most Americans don't have wills and don't have these things in place, so that's important. But there is some research that looks at the population that does, and the people of color in that population are just as likely to have charitable estate provisions as the white donors in that population. So once people, people are doing that, people of color are no less generous or are still using those instruments in the same way. There's another study which showed that, for instance, African-American donors with these kind of estate plans, they prioritize family, church, and then charity. Whereas the white donors prioritize family, it was family, church, and then charity. Yeah, and then the white donors would do family, church, charity, and then church. So again, so there's a different organization and a different thinking, which speaks to one, organizations telling their stories, as kind of given many examples here, but also being open to those conversations and helping donors to see your place as a viable pathway. And the other thing, and thinking about those wealth dynamics again, people of color with high net worth tend to be first generation. It's that new money, as folks say, right? And the thing about that dynamic is, while you're building it, you're trying to hold on to it. You're trying to, sustain it. And also we see, there's surveys about this, where this population of high net worth people of color, they also have a broader range of familial and other obligations that you don't typically see with the white population. They're taking care of that great auntie, and they're putting that nephew through school. They bought that niece that car. All of these things affect the dynamic for this new first generation wealth. So there's a lot of things that go into it, which get back to speaking about the relational dynamics and how you're building those long-term relationships with these donors, and being able to have those kinds of conversations with them.
Thank you. Thank you. Virgil, I think you want to ask the next question?
Sure. President Rowena, this is going to be perfect to, like I said, to give to you, because earlier you spoke about advancement professional organizations. So this is a rather lengthy question. The question is, university advancement professional organizations like CASE do not typically pay attention to the cultivation of donors who hold first generation, international, or other diverse identities. As alumni at all of our institutions continue to diversify, when will the techniques for outreach, donor engagements, etc., change this? And the audience member did mention that this is a frustrating and also missed opportunity. Do you want to answer that, President Rowena?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, in terms of some of the models for advancement that, are out there, like CASE, we too need to talk about cultural responsiveness, in relation to advancement work and philanthropy. I know for SJCC, one of our longtime supporters, the family won money off of a lottery, and they started a family foundation, focused on empowering Latinx communities and civic engagement. And so Carmen Castellano, who passed away last year, she was one of the leaders in our community that was sort of pushing the envelope on, philanthropy in the Valley, and, talking about cultural responsiveness, and then also challenging philanthropy to support, some of the smaller foundations that had emerged coming from minoritized communities. So I think that's how I would respond to it. It is a challenge. And I know from my perspective and the work that I've done, with individual donors and also smaller foundations, that you do need to, sometimes it is the cultural aspect, that helps you make that connection and build the relationship for partners. So for me, coming from an Asian Pacific, American background, Filipina background, immigrant background, I'm able to connect, faster and in a deeper way, with local foundations and also national foundations, that have and value those stories, and family members might be coming, from a same background. So, but definitely for, bigger organizations that many of us pay lots of money to do professional development to attend, there needs to be some changes there, around cultural responsiveness in terms of their professional development.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Yep.
thank you, Rowena. So here's a question. We've got about 6 more minutes, but and feel free to answer. I'm very interested in the response. So this is specifically about HBCUs, and the question is, how can we empower HBCU leadership to seek more philanthropic dollars and to be more aggressive in terms of their fundraising strategies? And so I'm curious, whoever wants to answer can answer, but and it kind of links to something like, the other day I was in a session where we were talking about the role of fundraising for new presidents of colleges and universities. And there were some people in the room who just said, well, I don't really want to raise money. I'm uncomfortable with that, right? And we know that as a president, you absolutely have to become comfortable with it and have to do that. But how, and I don't know who might want to respond to this, but any thoughts on how you can empower more HBCU presidents in particular to fundraise, seek philanthropic dollars? Thoughts?
So that one feels like it begs for a commentary from me. So I would say this. Don't assume that HBCU presidents aren't seeking philanthropic dollars and that they aren't aggressively out doing so. But I want to give you some context. Our jobs require us to do more than just fundraise. So there's a luxury that my non-HBCU peers in predominantly white institutions tend to have that, quite frankly, I don't have. One, and I'll just give you an example. My parents will email me. Sometimes they will call me. And they're not going to really be happy to hear that they got pushed off to, because this is how they feel, got pushed off to some other staff member. Now, I am positive that my peers at larger or predominantly white institutions aren't fielding those same things. There isn't that expectation that parents will be able to engage with the college president, right? Now, I love engaging with them, but that takes time, right? And that takes time away from things that you may be able to do. The other thing, and this is really fascinating, is some of our philanthropic partners have begun to understand how to streamline the process. Because we don't have staffs of 200 fundraisers. we might not have staffs of 10 fundraisers, right? Or 5,
Five.
right? So, many times when there is a proposal put out, the amount of things that go into amassing the responses to those requests or to those applications, it's a bit onerous, just to be candid. And it's reasonable it's reasonable. People, look, it's your money. You can ask anything you want for any amount of information. And I get it. But sometimes, like, it's just a lot. And there's only so many of us. Like, we have smaller staffs. So then we have to be like, you can't take a scattershot approach. And by the way, it's the same approach that you sometimes have to take in recruiting, right? We've identified a handful of cities and a handful of schools in those cities that we concentrate our efforts in. And we've been highly successful with that. It's the same thing we do with our fundraising. We have cultivated a set number of individuals or organizations, and we push for those individuals. So, or cultivate the relationship with those individuals. And that has tended to be successful. So I wouldn't say we don't want to. I think it's a product of time and resources.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tyrone, did you have a comment about that? I wasn't sure if you.
No, it's fine. No, there's nothing else to say. He dropped the mic.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we are going to have to wrap it up, but there are still lots of questions, but we'd be here for forever. I wanted to first of all say thank you so much to our wonderful panel. Thank you for all of the knowledge, and I love the idea of having practitioners and scholars together. I think it's really important. And thank you to Brandy for doing our tech. And then I just want to say a special thanks to Virgil for co-hosting and for bringing us this great idea to do this. We really, really appreciate it. For everyone, check out the work of all of our panelists who have all done great work, either in practice or research. I also want to just give a little shout out for the journal that NOAA edits, Philanthropy and Education, because it really is the place for getting strong and rigorous research related to philanthropy, and also take a look at the work that Tyrone is doing at the Lilly family School of Philanthropy. Important if you're interested in research. And thank you so much. We really appreciate you all being with us, and hopefully you will be with us for part 2, where we will bring in some more amazing people to talk about this topic. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.